Welcome everybody to New Polity's podcast, and particularly the series Political Saints. I am very honored to be joined today by Father Daniel Utrecht of the Toronto Oratory. He wrote this extraordinary book called The Lion of Munster, and it is the Lion of Munster who will be our subject today, Blessed Clemens August von Galen. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So before we get into the Blessed Bishop, or later Cardinal, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I was born in Cincinnati, grew up in a Catholic household in Troy, Ohio. Went to the University of Dallas, sort of for all the wrong reasons, because of adolescent vanity, because they offered me a scholarship and phoned me up and said, "We want you, son." So I went there, and it ended up being the perfect place to go. And that's there that I learned that we had a Catholic intellectual tradition that I was shocked that I didn't know about before. So I thought, okay, I've got to go into teaching. So I went to graduate school in philosophy, because St. Thomas's philosophy was the big thing that got me. Went to the University of Toronto, and there a friend of mine who thought he had a vocation found out about a community in Montreal called the Oratory of St. Philip Neri. It was a brand new community, founded in 1975. He joined in 1979. And when he did that, it kind of made me think again, maybe I'm supposed to be a priest. That thought that came and went a few times. And then they moved from Montreal to Toronto in September of 1979, just after I had gone to Rome to teach for a semester for the University of Dallas, which has a sophomore semester program in Rome.
So you weren't going to them up in Montreal. They thought
No.
they'd at least come to you.
Yeah, they had
Yeah.
the mountain had to come to Mohammed. Yes, yes. And my friend wrote to me from Montreal and said, "Yes, I have joined," just before they moved. "When you're in Rome, would you please go to St. Philip's tomb in the Chiesa Nuova and pray for me and for us?" So I had a kind of spiritual connection with the Toronto Oratory before coming back from Rome. And then Rome itself was an influence. We had this young new pope, you might have heard of, John Paul II, who was, golly, he was like 9 years younger then than I am now. And it was long before he hit the episcopal retirement age of 75 in 1995. Since then, we haven't had a pope under the age for a bishop's retirement. But anyway, he was just starting his theology of the body talks at his Wednesday audiences, and so one of my colleagues, who was a Cistercian monk, said, "This is good. There's going to be vocations inspired by this guy." And that hit into my head a little bit. So when I came back from Rome, I started going to the Oratory for Mass, and this was days of confusion in the church that started in the middle 60s, let's say. Yeah. And this is now early 1980, and I had been part of a kind of community of graduate students, mostly Catholic or Catholic-minded, who had been trying to discuss among ourselves what's happened to the church, why, what, and at the Oratory I saw these were priests who dressed like priests, taught the Catholic faith from the pulpit, did beautiful liturgy. There was a Latin Mass in the Novus Ordo, which I loved. And then Father Jonathan Robinson, who was the founder of that community, died 2 years ago, invited me out to dinner And I got invited, started coming out for dinner for a regular time, and then being sat down by him, and he's telling me, well, I think maybe you're supposed to join us. And eventually I gave in. And I moved into the house first as a boarder, and I felt strange very quickly being the only one in the house not wearing a habit, which was a strange feeling to feel strange about.
Yeah.
But I told him, okay, I think I give in. And he said, fine, we'll clothe you on Sunday, it's totally contrary to the rules that we have about accepting a postulant. But we didn't have, being a new community, they hadn't really worked out the rules for this yet.
Wow.
Because I wasn't in the house as a postulant, I was in the house as a boarder. Now we have someone in the house as a postulant for a month after we've had him earlier for a week. And then we vote about whether to accept him. And I was in the house for less than a month, and I said, okay, I give up, and I was clothed in less than a month. So I was clothed on the feast of Saints Peter and Paul, and I moved in on the 1st of June. So.
Wow. Justin Martyr. There you are. 1st of June. Yeah. Great place to start. And how did you come then to find yourself in Germany some years later and happening upon this good bishop we're about to talk about?
My dad was of German descent. We weren't really quite clear where we were from in Germany. We've never totally sorted that out, but he spoke German. He used it in the war against the Nazis. But when I started high school, it was the first year that they reintroduced German as an option for foreign language studies in my high school in Troy, Ohio, Troy High School.
Reopened, you're saying? Did they
cancel? Yeah. I mean, I think
it
canceled during the war or before. I don't know when, but anyway, it hadn't been there. My 2 older brothers had a choice between Spanish, French, and Latin, and German was now being offered, and so I did the 3 years of German, and then a little bit more in university, and so I had an interest in being able to go there. After I was at the Oratory, our superior founder, Father Robinson, who had been a chaplain to the Knights of Malta, knew through the Knights of Malta a German nobleman, Dietrich Graf Spee, who lived in the Toronto area at that time. And he had arranged for Father to spend a summer at a castle in Germany, saying Mass in the Schlosskapelle. And it was the castle that's on the cover of the coffee table books about castles in Germany. And subsequently, he had a letter from a friend of his, an old lady, Countess, Baroness Maria von Ketteler, who said, "Why do you send the priests to other people and not to me?" And the thought that I wanted to see if I could improve my German, which is in great need of improvement, got me an invitation to her house in 1989. And she invited me to stay 2 weeks with her, and then 2 weeks with her son Clemens and his wife Paula. And they were kind enough to say, come back. So I went back again 2 years after that, 3 years after that, and really every 2 or 3 years I would go to visit some member of the Ketteler family. Can't say my German got totally better from all that, but did have the opportunity to work on it a little bit.
Just before we go on, what does being royal mean in Germany these days?
Well, guys, these guys aren't royal. They were from
nobility.
Old noble families, yes. And it means nothing politically or legally now. The Germans, as far as I understand it, did a slightly different thing from the Austrians. The Austrians just took away all titles. The Germans, you end up making it part of your name. So you get Freiherr von something or other as part of your baptismal name. It's on your birth certificate. But being a Freiherr or a Baron, or being a Graf, a Count, doesn't mean anything other than that you are part of this family and you learn something about the old kind of family traditions and the traditions of how somebody from what the British might call a good family,
Right. Yeah.
ought to behave and ought to live.
Right. So it is kind of a holdover of the past, of
Yeah.
a certain dignity of custom and such.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think that depends on the family and the individual.
And maybe the house is just
yeah.
a physical representation of that too.
So I was once at a birthday party at which the burgers were catered by a company called the Burger Prince. Now over here, Burger King is not a king, but over there, this was a real prince who ran this company where it had this little truck in which they made fancy burgers.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I hope that they used some paprika or something fancy.
That was good.
Yeah. And so along along the way, you actually met the family members of Blessed von Galen.
Clemens August von Galen's mother was a Spee, so she's somehow related to Dietrich Spee, the one that we knew who lived in Toronto, who's now retired in Bonn. Clemens August von Galen's paternal grandmother was a Kettler, so all the Kettlers were also related. So both of these families had something of a devotion to the cardinal. And Dietrich Spee had given us 2 thick books in German, which were in our guest room, in case a guest came in who wanted to read German stuff, of sermons, letters, documents from the time that Clemens August von Galen became bishop in 1933 until his death. And I also met his nephew and a few of his daughters at different times. So I began to know more and more about this man and how he spoke out against the Nazis. And sometimes for bedtime reading, I try to read, say, one of these sermons or a letter or something like that in these 2 thick books. Just a lot of dictionary help. But eventually, as I'm going through this, I'm thinking, man, this is fascinating stuff. I wish somebody would write a good book about this man in English so I don't have to slog through all this German stuff. But that didn't come out, and I kept slogging through all the German stuff and eventually said, well, okay, maybe I can try to do it. So that's the kind of origin of
the genesis,
the line of Munster.
the origin myth of this book.
Yeah.
Well, so can you tell us then about, so he himself comes from this noble family.
Comes from an old German family that, you trace I trace my family back to 1850 or so in Cincinnati, and he traces his family back to 12th or 13th century. He was the 11th of 13 children.
They always say that the 11th of 13 children is going to make it big.
Or end up in the church, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Right. But it's not always what we might think. Because I eventually came to visit the house that he grew up in, which is called a castle, but it's really like a big farmhouse and a barn with a moat around it. It's Zatsky, and it's now his nephew gave that property to a community of Benedictine sisters. Some nuns live in that house now, and they have some memorabilia about him there, and helped me with my research. When he was a boy, they lived a very, very strict kind of life. No running water, no heat in most of the rooms. You had to get up. You get up in the morning, you go across the moat around the corner to the chapel for Mass. And if you were late for Mass, you got no butter for your bread at breakfast. And if you missed Mass, you didn't get any breakfast at all. I think that was the story, something like that. So, and he and the brother closest to him, Franz, were late one morning for serving Mass, and he said, "Franz, wake up, we got to serve." And Franz said, "We may as well just lie in bed because we're not going to get breakfast anyway."
The real motivation.
Yeah.
But yet, how strict this family was, it led to an immense amount of sanctity. I mean, not only do they have a son who's been beatified by Pope Benedict XVI, but wasn't 2 grandchildren were also beatified?
So no, what? So this is one of his second cousins.
Okay,
is beatified. Who's the nun who persuaded Leo XIII to consecrate the world. No, was it Leo XIII or Pius X? To consecrate the world to the Sacred Heart in 1899.
Wow.
She worked among prostitutes in Portugal. So the tradition of service, whether in the church or to the state, was important because his father was in the Reichstag in politics. His brother became a politician as well, and a soldier before that. And he came to the realization that he was called to the priesthood.
And he realized this. No, at some point in your book you mentioned that he was actually schooled in Austria because there was some trouble that was happening between the church and the state in Germany at the time.
So this somehow goes back to Bismarck and the Kulturkampf, the kind of attack on the Catholic Church, in order to consolidate a united Germany about 1870 or so, 1869, 1870. Bismarck wanted to lessen the influence of the Catholic Church. I don't know whether he was trying to build a national church or not, but the standard thing with powerful politicians is let's do things like get rid of the religious orders because they're a waste of time unless they're actually doing something practical. Maybe if they're teaching in schools or nursing, we might let them go. So it's like Gerard Manley Hopkins' poem, "The Wreck of the Deutschland," was from that time about some nuns who drowned because the ship on which they were leaving the country foundered. And Clemens August von Galen grew up with stories about that. But still, by the time that he was in school, he went to a boarding school run by the Jesuits, but the anti-Jesuit laws were still on the books, so that he couldn't get the Abitur, the high school certificate of graduation from a Jesuit school. So he finished his high school back in his hometown.
Gotcha.
And did the Abitur there, and then went off to the seminary.
And when he was in seminary, or rather after he's in seminary, he's placed in Berlin for a little while. Could you just give us a quick snapshot on how Berlin versus Munich? And
all right, so he actually thought about becoming a Jesuit because he was educated by the Jesuits. Yeah. He ended up being ordained as a priest for the Diocese of Munster in 1905. We should get to, he was born in 1878.
All right, that's helpful.
We need
Thanks
to have
for
a
placing us. Yeah.
so he was ordained about, I think, in 1905. Served for a short time as chaplain to an uncle of his who was an auxiliary bishop, and went around with him on confirmation tours and visits of the diocese. Berlin was part at that time of the Diocese of Breslau, or Wrocław, now in Poland, home of Edith Stein.
Ah, okay, thanks.
And largely a Protestant city for those who still had any belief, because in the early part of the 20th century, you have already kind of a loss of faith in the big cities. You also have at this time a lot of people leaving the farm and going to the cities to work in factories. And because of that, there was a significant number of Catholics Catholics, mostly young men, but not only, moving to Berlin. And there was a tradition that some of the other dioceses helped in some of the parishes in Berlin. So the Diocese of Munster looked after a big parish in the heart of Berlin, and von Galen served there for over 20 years. And first as an associate pastor, then he realized that these young men who were coming to work in the factories and other industries needed something, some housing and some kind of support for living a Catholic life. So he built a home for young men coming to Berlin, lived with them, paid for it out of his inheritance. It's one thing about that kind of, I don't know. As the 11th child, he nevertheless had a huge inheritance from his father, which he gave to this thing and built a church for them.
That's outstanding. I mean, that was one of the things that drew my attention to him insofar as he is already living in the midst of a huge societal change.
Yeah.
He has to go and be schooled in Austria because there is this subversions of authority in the German understanding of the place of the church in the world.
To be fair, I mean, I think this was an old boarding school that a lot of people wealthy and noble with people would send their sons to. Yeah.
And then,
but he couldn't get his degree there because of this.
Right.
Yeah. Get his high school diploma there.
And then he has this. He sees in the city this changing demographic where people are leaving the farms, going to factories. We could probably discuss for a while what actually was the leading cause of a major shift, but it was a major shift, that's happening at this time, of a major social order that's changing and turning into this modern way of living. And he's there to kind of catch
he's try to do something to keep these people living the faith, and he sees in the people who've already been in Berlin for a while, he's just shocked to see Catholic parents who have no interest in baptizing their children.
Right. Yeah.
And then the kind of breakdown in morality.
Yes, and that is one of the lines that, well, maybe I'll let you share this, that his descendant shared with you about how they capture the dynamic of the family, is that they were just absolutely Catholic to the core. I won't steal the line, but you got to share it with us.
No, it's his nephew told me this, that the cardinal told him. Well, he probably wasn't a cardinal when he told him, but we Galens were not very smart. We're not very good looking, which isn't true. Aber wir sind brutal katholisch. We are brutally Catholic.
I just love that line. We're brutally Catholic.
Yeah. So I think that's what made me write the book.
Yeah.
I gotta write about this guy.
I mean, to see then for a brutally Catholic, man, parents not wanting to baptize their kids.
Yeah,
what on earth is going on? I mean, this guy's Catholic to his core. This stuff is true.
Yeah.
It fundamentally alters everything in life. Yeah. What are you doing abandoning it?
Yeah. And his whole life was based on Corpus Christi procession. These feasts, the church's calendar was the source of life, and the name days. Germans a lot of other Europeans too, are bigger on celebrating your name days than your birthdays. So he would always send a letter off to a sister or a brother or a mom or dad on their name day when he was away from home.
Wow. Yeah. With all the siblings, he's asked to write one of those
every
single day.
Yeah.
So, all right. So he's in Berlin. He's seeing kind of the breakdown of the Catholic family.
Yeah.
He's really,
and then he lives through World War I there too.
War I. Yeah. Tell us about kind of his World War I experience. Where he was in Berlin.
He was in Berlin for the war. So and of course you have the entire shock of a great percentage of the German people when they think they're winning the war, because that's what their government propaganda tells them through the war, and then all of a sudden, oh, by the way, we lost, and then by the way, we've got a revolution and we're going to get rid of the emperor, and there's complete overthrow of the government, of the not just the government, the form of political life.
Yep. And you do at this point have, we'll get into this later, a new surge of political theology that starts to come in, and a completely new way of thinking. I
Yeah.
mean, Carl Schmitt is starting to get his rise at this time, and but we'll circle back to that and as we
Okay.
go on. So he's seeing this, and then what year does he return to Munich?
Münster.
Or Munster, sorry,
He
what am I
returns
saying?
to
Munich,
Munster
yeah.
in 1929.
Okay, is it that late? All right.
Just
He was there a long time in Berlin.
And I think it was 23 years in Berlin. And the main reason the bishop calls him back to Munster, there are probably others, but one main reason that he calls him back to Munster is this new National Socialist movement is gaining adherents. And some of the parties that they were related with in the Reichstag elections had gained some support among the Union of Catholic Nobles of Westphalia. The hope was that Father von Galen and his brother Franz, who was in the center party, the so-called Catholic Party in the Prussian Parliament, that they would be able to steer their fellow nobles into the direction of supporting the bishops in their condemnation of the Nazis and in supporting the Center Party.
So the bishops saw early on what National Socialism was.
Yeah.
All right. And there was no ands, ifs,
National
or buts
Socialism was condemned. Catholics were not permitted to take part in the National Socialist movement. And I have no idea really how many Catholics disobeyed that. I think the ones whom Galen was struggling with in the Union of Catholic Nobles, the Lüning brothers, were supporters of the German National Party, which was in working in conjunction with the Nazis, but they were not directly supporters of the Nazi Party.
Right.
Until later, when the Nazi Party was the only party around, and they became officials in the government for a time. They both saw that there was something wrong in this in the end, and in the end, one of them was a martyr, was killed for participating in the attempt on Hitler's life in July 1944.
There's a lot of martyrs in this story.
Yep.
But early on, I mean, it's, a lot of folks. It's embarrassing how poor our kind of German history is prior to the
mine
war.
too.
But yeah, but prior to really all of the euthanasia, eugenics, the horrific things, the Holocaust that comes about later on. What are kind of the telltale signs that the National Socialists, other than maybe the names giving it away, that the bishops, pointed out early on and saying, this is a problem. This is why Catholics can't join this party?
Well, they had a kind of ideology of that the nation, the state, the race really is what's divine.
Right.
And this becomes clearer after they take power, and their main minister of Nazi Weltanschauung is Alfred Rosenberg, who has written this book called The Myth of the 20th Century, in which Rosenberg says that basically we're bringing back the paganism of our ancestors, and maybe or maybe not calling it Christian, but this is Christianity is being attacked by a pagan ideology, and an ideology that says that God is not a transcendent creator of the universe, but God comes to be through human decisions, and God is coming to be the God that's coming to be is the German national Nordic Aryan race, and then combined with that is that there's no such thing as a transcendent moral law. Right and wrong is depending on what serves the interests of the race or not.
It's amazing how it really is kind of Thomas Hobbes 101, and you conflate that together with, and of course there's this statement. I mean, you cite here that when Bishop von Galen reflects on the philosophy, the ideology that's being purported during the day, he says this is even worse than what Satan did in the garden. He's not saying just that you can become God, but rather you can create God.
Yep.
And this is, I mean, this is a big problem. And the reason why, obviously, I bring out Hobbes is that the Leviathan, the God amongst us, is our creation. But it's not just any one of us. It is, once we bind ourselves together, we have a power greater than any one of us.
Yeah. Okay. That sounds like very,
And also that a power that no one person can actually control. So everybody kind of thinks in this situation about Hitler. Hitler's in control. Hitler is not in control. He's following the whims of the people just as much as they're, feeling out his rhetoric and that movement that's going on. And so the blessed bishop is priest, Father.
He's a priest at this point.
In this case, starts to point some of these things out. And anyways, we'll keep going in the biography and get into the weeds in a bit. Sorry, though. I'm getting excited too.
Well, we both jumped around a bit, I think. So.
That's great. So he's doing what the bishops ask him to do at this point.
Yeah. Yes, and he thinks this is his plum job, in a sense. That as a priest, he wants to serve. He is now, so he's about 52 when he comes back to 51, 52 when he comes back to Munster, and he's pastor of the most central church and most important church in the city, outside the cathedral itself, which is just a couple blocks away. And so he thinks this is it. This is where I'll finish the rest of my life as pastor of Saint Lambert's Kirche. But then, we're going into the next step.
Let's do it. Yeah. That's great.
So then the bishop dies in early 1933. Also in early 1933, Adolf Hitler is named chancellor.
An opposing bishop. Yeah.
So what happens eventually, it took some time for a new bishop to be named for Munster, and eventually, because the first person who was elected by the cathedral chapter decided on health grounds not to accept it. Now, I don't know enough about him. I think there may be an argument that he and another person who would have been elected in a subsequent vote also said, let it be known that he wouldn't take the job. And I think both of these men knew that the times required a bishop with more strength than they had.
Well, good of them to know that.
Yeah.
And so von
Galen. So it's kind of curious because he knew the Secretary of State, Cardinal Pacelli, who had been nuncio in Munich and then in Berlin. So he knew him well in Berlin. The famous Sister Pascalina, who was his secretary, Pope Pius' secretary as Pope after he became Pope, said that, joked with Cardinal von Galen when he came to Rome to become a cardinal after the war was over, that the Pope knew very well that he wasn't really a very good preacher, and in fact, he himself was said to have been giving a catechism lesson to children about their need to get a new bishop and what a bishop ought to be like. And then to see if they were understanding the lesson, he asked the kids, could I become bishop? Because like Sister Pascalina couldn't, right? Yeah. Could I become bishop? And this little kid says, no, because my dad says you totally can't preach. Right? He became one of the greatest preachers that we've ever seen in the church. So
but that was to come.
The way the election of a bishop worked for Munster, and it was under the Concordat, which the church already had with the Prussian government, was that the cathedral chapter and different bishops and others would suggest a list of names to the nuncio. From these different lists, the nuncio would come up with 3 names that the Holy Father would present to the cathedral chapter. The cathedral chapter would choose from among those 3 names, and then the government had to give its nihil obstat. And although many of the people who suggested names suggested von Galen as a candidate, he was not on the first terna, the first list of 3. And then the one who was elected didn't accept. So then the Holy See said, okay, choose from among the 2 left. And the one of those who would have been elected said, no, I won't take it if I get elected. And then you can't have an election with only one candidate. So von Galen's name was added, and then he was elected. And then eventually the government accepted. So he was the first bishop chosen in Germany after the Nazi seizure of power.
Wow. That's quite a statement, especially given his he probably did more in articulating the real philosophical problems of the Nazis amongst the priests at the time. Say or at least one of the top.
I think there were some others who had more of a kind of philosophical bent who did some things, but and von Galen always said that he learned from his father, the politician, to study everything from the basis of first principles.
Right.
And he was not a great scholar, but he got a grasp of those first principles, and he could explain them very clearly, as became evident.
Yes.
More later on.
Yes.
For some reason, the government didn't object to his choice, and there were people at the time who thought that he was sympathetic to Nazism.
Why?
Because this is what happens when you label people, right? He's conservative.
Right. Yes.
He's from an old noble family. He's a German patriot.
Right.
And there were some aspects on which there were similar approaches that a lot of Germans agreed with the idea that the peace treaty of Versailles after the First World War was unjust to the Germans. Right. And it wasn't only Germans who thought this.
You're right. Absolutely.
Economic consequences of the peace.
Yeah.
And then there were a lot of Germans who were not totally happy with the revolution that overturned the empire and led to, and a lot of Germans who were not happy with the creation of Germany as a parliamentary democracy. And then the parliamentary democracy in that particular case didn't work very well.
Yeah.
And they had to keep having elections over and over again, and you ended up with having so many different parties, fights in the streets, particularly between Nazis and communists, and yet those two parties being the ones that had the largest number of seats, but they would never work together.
Right.
So something kind of not necessarily had to give, but we learned from Plato and Aristotle, don't we, that if once a democracy doesn't work for a while, you're going to end up with a dictatorship or a kingship or something. Right?
Absolutely.
Right?
Yep. So they were proven right again in this case. So now Bishop von Galen comes into power, and
Power.
he comes into authority. Let's say that. How
Okay.
about comes
Okay.
into authority?
Yeah.
He is now pastor of Munster, and things are getting progressively worse during this time. That you have, of course, you have. The schools overturned, the crucifixes being taken out of schools, new curriculum being introduced, and this is this really his first public battle with the state?
So his first complaint to the state to a state official was within a couple of weeks of his becoming bishop.
Got busy right away.
So probably a background for a little bit, that the Holy See had entered into a concordat with the new government. The idea was to get guarantees that the church could continue to function, have Catholic schools, direct the religious education of Catholic schools, have Catholic organizations of different kinds that were traditionally already in place. And also because Cardinal Pacelli, who later became Pius XII, knew very well that those guarantees that the government gave were probably going to be broken by the government, because he knew the kind of people he was dealing with. At least it gave these agreements the status of an international treaty, so that violations of this treaty could be complained about.
Right, to the neighbors, yes.
So Catholic schools were still in existence in 1933, and the religious curriculum was supposed to be done in coordination with church officials, with bishops, basically, or their representatives. And the Minister of Education put out a lesson plan for the month of November, for the month of the Holy Souls, which consisted in attacks on the Jews in every area of the curriculum.
Wow. Everything. Okay, so can you give us an example?
Or economic or financial matters. We talk about how the Jews run the banks and they've caused, they take over all the money.
Right.
Ethnology, we're going to do masks about Jewish facial features. The religion classes will be about how the Jewish people have corrupted every nation that they've ever been part of. It's horrible stuff.
Yeah.
And Bishop von Galen wrote to the education minister and said, this violates the principles of the Concordat, and it's kind of difficult to see how this particular lesson plan that you're drawing has anything to do with the month of the Holy Souls.
Yeah. Does he get a response?
He basically got no response to that one. And this became, not only in Munster, but all throughout Germany, the bishops systematically, and sometimes the Holy See directly, the bishops systematically would write a letter of complaint or issue some kind of message to the appropriate government official every time the Concordat was violated, and often get no response. Very, very, very rarely get a response saying, yes, you're right, we'll change this. And more often get the sort of delaying tactic that bureaucrats know how to use.
Yeah, they're genius at it. Yeah, that's why they exist.
Yeah.
That's right.
This eventually becomes a problem between von Galen and other bishops.
How so?
in that he came certainly by 1936, if not by 1935, I can't remember exactly, to the conclusion that this policy of complaining behind closed doors, but keeping the public face of cooperation between this church and the state on proper sort of grounds, making it look good, was no longer working. And that the only way forward would be if we publicly protest every violation of the Concordat and every time that a bishop is thrown out of his diocese, which happened in one diocese. Publicly say from the pulpit what's actually going on in Germany.
Right. And instead, Cardinal
Bertram was the Archbishop of Breslau, so he was the head of the Bishops' Conference, the senior bishop in Germany. And he was of the policy of continuing the quiet negotiations kind of thing. He knew that the Nazis were bad news.
Right. But what else are you going to do?
And he was older than von Galen and more senior, and he remembered the Kulturkampf as a child, and that was bad. So but the crucial thing here was that von Galen knew that I can't decide as an individual bishop to take this on, because we have to speak as a united front.
Sure.
Because if they divide us up from each other, we're sunk.
Right. Yep, that's true. But also, I mean, just kind of later part in your book, you mentioned that Goebbels thought that they should not attack. Once, I'm kind of giving away a little part of the story here, Bishop von Galen does start to go after the Nazis, and Goebbels has to make a decision. What do we do? How do we retaliate? And as you put it in the book, that in his opinion, it was best during the war to try as much as possible to steer the churches in the direction of the regime rather than to provoke them. So actually, ironically, what Cardinal Bertram was suggesting actually fit in perfectly. It doesn't look like
worked well for the Nazis.
It worked great for the Nazis. It was the very thing they wanted the cardinals to do, the bishops to do, to just seem like there is some peace.
Well, and also, I mean, von Galen would have been happy with that in a way, in that what he hoped for at the start was that, this is the government we're stuck with, and he was very, very, very strong on the idea that a legitimate government compels the obedience of its subjects unless it's telling them to do something sinful.
Right. Yeah.
Or unless it's doing something fundamentally unjust.
Right.
So he wants to find peace if it's possible.
Sure. Yep. And this just became impossible.
He came to the conclusion earlier than Cardinal Bertram did that it was impossible.
So you said a moment ago that it was around 1936, 1937. And at this time, Pius XI already sees what's going on and that things aren't going well and something does need to be spoken of publicly. And so he calls Bishop von Galen and one other to begin to consult with him on a new encyclical.
He calls 5 bishops to Rome.
Okay,
and he's sick at the time.
Right.
But he knows the situation in Germany is bad. There's systematic violations of the Concordat. Very, very clear that, as you put it in diplomatic things, the other contracting partner in this treaty is violating the terms of the treaty.
Right.
The one partner being the German state and the other partner being the Holy See, because it's really a concordat with the Holy See, not with the German bishops as such. So naturally, he calls for consultation the 3 senior bishops of Germany, the 3 cardinals, which is Bertram, Frings, Don't ask me. You can read it in my book. But then two bishops, both of whom are noblemen, and both of whom are very outspoken opponents of Nazism, von Galen of Münster and von Preysing of Berlin. And it seems that in the conversations in Rome, Cardinal Bertram was still arguing for continuing the policy as it was, and was also saying critical things, let's say, of von Galen, thinking that von Galen thinks he can boss us bishops around as if we're Westphalian peasants. But the Pope and Cardinal Pacelli, not far away from becoming Pope, a couple years away from becoming Pope, agree that something stronger needs to be done and write an encyclical letter. Did you want to?
Sure, yeah. Well, this is, I mean, this is kind of a firebrand encyclical level on so many fronts. I mean, it's respectful insofar as they say that we're searching for peace, that we are hoping that the Concordat might be recognized, even though we expect that it won't be. But we need to return back to these first principles. Where did we get wrong here? And we'll go through this more carefully. But one of the major things that they bring up at the beginning is, well, certainly there's this predicament where the state is being considered idolatrously. I mean,
as God, as divine. The state is divine, or the race is divine, or maybe it's this one man who's divine, because at one place in brennender Sorge, the encyclical that came out, the Holy Father is clarifying religious terminology. Because this ideology has taken religious terminology to itself.
Right.
Right. The Nazis have been saying, we're the only people who have faith. We've been believers for a long time. You Christians, you Catholics don't have faith. And well, yes, we've been believers in a certain ideology of the German race. If that's what belief means, that's not really what the Catholic Church understands by belief. We believe in a transcendent God, and you guys don't, right? So, and so Pius clarifies the meaning of terms like God, like faith, and says that, and this is echoing things that von Galen wrote back in 1934.
Right. Yep.
When he first started attacking Rosenberg in a public way, which we skipped past.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Maybe this is the time we can start to hit on some of that and move on into stories.
Yeah. But part of that was also, if you give kind of divine authority or give a kind of sense that a man, no matter how great a man he is sort of like divine, or put him on an equal level with Christ, then that's wicked and evil and false.
Right.
And that's what
is really being communicated.
German ideology was, the Nazi ideology was teaching about Hitler.
Yeah, so to read it directly from the encyclical, Pius XI, with von Galen's help here, writes, "Whoever exalts race or the people or the state or a particular form of state or the depositories of power or any other fundamental value of the human community, however necessary and honorable their function in worldly things, whoever raises these notions above their standard value and divinizes them to an idolatrous level, distorts and perverts an order of the world planned and created by God. He is far from the true faith in God and from the concept of life which that faith upholds." So this, as you know, is kind of harkens back, or there's some resonances here to were pastoral letters, even when he was just a priest. I mean, which is kind of incredible. I mean,
Yeah.
the
Or newspaper articles too.
or
he wrote.
newspaper
Yeah,
articles, and I want to just read
newspaper
one,
columns.
and
Okay.
then I want to, I expect that you write newspaper articles now, just like this, as you're saying.
No, sir.
So this is.
I have to get permission to write books. Newspaper articles are out of the question.
Yeah. So this he writes, the idea of the state as God, the idea of an all-powerful, boundlessly mighty state, owing no duties to anyone, that was the sickness of the German ideology. It says Prussian Germany did not understand how to earn the inner loyalty of its citizens.
So let me just interrupt for
Yeah,
a second.
please.
So this was the pre-World War I government he's talking about.
This is
the
written-
government of the emperor.
This is 1918 when he writes this. Yes, and he's seeing this transition.
That they were already thinking that of a state as all powerful.
That's right.
Yep. And that was why the revolution happened.
Right.
Or why the revolution succeeded.
Right. Yeah. Yes. So here we go. Prussian Germany did not understand how to earn the inner loyalty of its citizens. The state was constantly putting itself first. That above all else was what alienated its citizens. The state is everything. The individual person is nothing. He has no freedom, no rights, no self-determination other than what the state confers upon him. The state is the only source of rights. That is where the central point of the national blame is to be found. That is the sickness that brought down our German Empire, despite its apparent splendor.
Mm-hmm.
So, 20 years later, they're making the same exact mistake. But just before, it seems almost crazy. Maybe if we just hear these words, that this idea of divinizing the state, I think we're starting to do that again. In many ways. And we were chatting this morning about this idea that he brings out here, when this all freedoms and all rights that a person has is derived from the state. Whether or not you're making the move to say, well, yeah, the state's God, it's making that explicit. There is the absolute conference of divine power upon the state if you're doing something like that.
If you say the state grants rights rather than that the rights are inherent in the human person created by God.
Right.
That's
the problem. And of course, this is so clearly demonstrated within abortion, or even with eugenics or euthanasia, where it's decided, well, actually the state has the right to decide who lives, who dies. And, something we were mentioning this morning, that even the decision, even with Glorious Dobbs, the overturning of Roe,
right,
there's still implicit within that decision that the state, or now states, have the decision whether or not to confer the right of life upon somebody. That we're still stuck in that same ideology.
Sure. I mean, Roe made the point at some point that, of course, if it were proved that human life begins at conception, then you'd have a person there, and that person would be inviolable. Right. But Dobbs, in overturning Roe, doesn't go back to that point. Doesn't overturn it on that basis.
Right. Yes. Just that there's a confusion. There's this plethora of ideas what freedom is, and this such, and this just needs to be debated amongst the states.
And it's really an issue. It's really an issue of constitutionally, is this something that judges should decide, or is it something that the legislatures should decide?
So we're kind of stuck in the same idea. We're not calling the state God, but we're conferring upon the state these divine attributes. Von Galen is calling this out, saying this was our problem in Imperial Germany. Then he's helping Pius XI again call it out, and the Nazis again. And this is the battle that's raging.
Staatsomnipotence.
Yeah.
State omnipotence.
Yes.
That's Staatsabsolutismus. Absolutism of the state. And he tied it in with legal positivism, right? And a law becomes a law if it's passed by whatever the governing power is.
Right.
Regardless of whether it violates fundamental human rights or some other principle that ought to be respected because of God's creation.
Right. And this is this is really coming up head on into a lot of German theorists at that time. I mean, Carl Schmitt, who ironically a lot of Catholics are holding on to today, and he was writing right around the same time, publishing books like Political Theology and the concept, and the political concept, or however you want to translate that, the concept of the political, where he's making the case that there is no higher authority than the state, that the state is where the buck stops, and that he ultimately came to defend and side with Hitler, not because he was won over by a prophetic preacher, as it were. This is how one great scholar working on Schmidt has put it, but because his theory led him to the belief that he had to go along with where the state authority brought him. And so here you have this absolute reversal in von Galen, saying we've misunderstood this. And then Pius XI actually, in this encyclical, does a fabulous job of saying, well, let's reconsider how law is created again, that everything does emerge from God, revealed in natural law, and that all human law is in some cases a derivative of the natural law. But it is through sin and through our guilt that we begin to have a cloudy vision of the natural law, which is ultimately when he says why we need the church to direct us, to redirect us in Revelation, to help us there. But that positive law system that you're talking about is now a completely different game than what the church has taught. Nothing derives from nature. Nothing is directed back to nature by the church. It is just by the pure declaration of peoples. I mean, we're stuck in a pretty dark place at that point.
Yeah.
And we went back and forth in email about this a little bit, but when I just have the Reichstag building in my mind when Benedict XVI.
I was just going to ask you about that.
When he went to Germany to speak before the parliament, he brings up many of the same things that Pius XI and Blessed von Galen, whom he beatified a few years earlier, discussed. And he, not only citing some of the exact same church fathers and the exact same passages as him, but even comes to this idea of saying the state authority cannot just be this legal structure, cannot have this, buck ends with it. And he turns to them and he says, when it comes to the decision of a democratic politician, the question of what now corresponds to the law of truth, what is actually right and may be enacted as law, is less obvious. It says, in terms of the underlying anthropological issues, what is right and may be given the force of law is in no way simply self-evident today. He puts it in another way when he's talking to the British government and saying, if the best that you have to go on is just a collective decision of a people, how can you be assured that is a proper correspondence to truth? It's the same idea here.
Same idea, and von Galen said it 100 years ago. If the people or a legislature or a dictator is the source of authority, the ultimate source of authority, then this opens up the door to perpetual revolution, the war of all against all, what intrigues me about von Galen is that he has a very, very, very strong sense of the authority of the state when it's within its legitimate grounds.
Sure, yeah.
The authority of the state comes from God, and that's why he was upset with the new constitution after I think it was 1922. Or maybe it was 1920 when the Weimar Republic was set up, because they were going to say that the power comes from the people. He said, no. Power, authority comes from God.
Right.
And if you don't, what you can say is that the people can decide how to elect the people who exercise that authority. But when they exercise that authority, unless they go beyond the bounds of their authority, the only reason they have the right to command our conscience is because, as Scripture teaches us, authority comes from God.
Yep. So this popular sovereignty myth is really the thing that he was attacking, that Pope Pius XI was attacking, that Pope Benedict XVI was attacking, on this one fluid motion here, saying we've really lost the plot if this is the idea that we're going for.
Well, I would just encourage your readers to read to your listeners to read that talk of Pope Benedict XVI at the Bundestag.
Yeah,
that is a brilliant piece of work.
Yeah, sure is. No, now that we're kind of have more of our political theological, straps on. How does he then start to realize, start to apply it, insofar as that he is recognizing an unjust government, one that is self-appointed, that is emerging out of pure agreement, that is also, doing what even Satan didn't do in creating its own God. Where's kind of the major issues that he then goes back home from Rome to fight?
So first thing, there's the practical thing that happens with regard to this encyclical, which I think is very fascinating.
Okay, yes, right? Please.
Pius XI, writes brennender Sorge, sends it in secret to all the bishops, has them have it read from the pulpits on Palm Sunday. And somehow all of this was done and spread throughout the country without the Nazi spies knowing about it.
That's extremely impressive.
Until the priests get up everywhere in Germany on Palm Sunday, and while the priest at the altar is quietly in the old Mass reading the Gospel of the Passion, somebody's at the microphone reading out the Pope's encyclical letter to the people. Wow. Von Galen also had more copies of it printed than any other diocese. Almost half of the total copies in all of Germany, about 120,000 copies, were printed by one publishing house in secret, working day and night by the light of the moon at nighttime, over about 5 days, because that's all the time they had to do this, so that these things could be handed out to people in the churches and distributed throughout the diocese. Wow. Could be handed out. The next step for him was trying to encourage Cardinal Bertram and the other bishops. We need to keep talking about this, because the reading of the encyclical not only brought new hope and strength and encouragement to Catholics, it also brought hope and encouragement and strength to Protestants, Jews, unbelievers of good conscience, to say that there's all sorts of evil already being done by our government, and the Church is standing up for fundamental human rights. And if we don't seize this opportunity to continue to press on this, it's already clear from the silence of the official newspapers and so on that the government, that the authorities are trying to cause this to just disappear under a cone of silence.
Yes.
So again, every time there's a violation of the Concordat, every time there's a violation of fundamental human rights, we need to speak about it publicly from every pulpit. All the bishops need to agree that we do this. And we will also be building a coalition not only of Catholics, but non-Catholics as well, who see that we're speaking on behalf of everybody's right to life, right to property, things like that. Because implicitly, the expropriation of Jewish properties, for instance, was included as something as a violation of fundamental human rights.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. And then that started to happen to Catholics.
Yeah,
and that's really what set him off. That was kind of as far as I've been able to tell, that's the straw that breaks the camel's back, as it were.
So now we're jumping to 1941.
I guess I am skipping a few years. Yeah,
okay. Which is fine, because this is what he's most famous for. His 3 famous sermons of the summer of 1941. But I'm glad we spent this time on this other material, absolutely. Because when I started to do my research, he didn't just do this out of the blue in 1941.
Yeah.
He did cool stuff before. Like I have an anecdote that we almost forgot to bring up.
Oh gosh, that was prior.
Sometime in the mid-30s. Because he's preaching against ideological things that Rosenberg is doing, and he's trying at that stage to separate off Hitler from Hitler's men, because Hitler had said when the Concordat was signed and when he took power that the Christianity is the basis of this new Germany we're rebuilding. Right? Then German ideologues, Nazi ideologues, are defining their own notion of Christianity, which has nothing to do with Christ. And so he accuses them of violating the Führer's word by bringing in religious controversy, where he says he doesn't want to have religious controversy. So the story is that at one point he was preaching about family life, and there were always Nazi informers in the church or cathedral, wherever he was preaching. At this point, he's preaching about family life, and one of them heckled and said, "Celibates have no business talking to us about family life." And he pounded his hand on the pulpit and he said, "I will tolerate no reflection on the Führer in my cathedral."
Yeah, chaste as a virgin, right?
Mr. Celibate Hitler, who's devoted his whole life to the service of his people, right? Right? Who teaches us all about family life, but he himself is celibate.
Yeah. He's getting right in their teeth at that point. I just love to hear the room react to that.
So, in 1941, at this stage, Germany's at war. And actually doing very well in the war. Only partly because we're not in it yet, Americans.
Back-to-back World War champions here, yeah.
Well, we have to realize like the Russians had a lot to do with it, and that's a real problem historically to deal with. But however, 1941, the Royal Air Force starts bombing cities. And they bomb Münster, and some people are killed and lots of property is damaged. And just at that time, the authorities come in to the houses of some of the religious orders and tell the priests, brothers, nuns, depending on which kind of community it is, we are expropriating your property. You must leave the city. You must leave the province, like within 24 hours. And this made him furious, not only because it was a theft of property, but also because it was implying that these people, these religious, were in some way enemies of the state. And therefore their property could be taken.
Right.
And they could be left as refugees to go find some other place in Germany to live. He provided a place at one of his family homes for some of them to go.
Oh, did he? I didn't. Okay.
Yeah. Well, I asked his nephew to do so, which he did. And at this point, this was only found about 15 or 20 years ago, I think. He wrote a letter to a fellow bishop in the nearby diocese of Osnabrück, Bishop Berning, and said, "I'm finding it hard to keep to the position we've been taking of going along with Cardinal Bertram's. I've always told myself he's senior, he's got more wisdom, but I'm finding it hard to." And I said that if I go out into public on my own, I might make things worse for the church and for them. But I can't do this anymore. And in early July, he got into the pulpit of the Lamberti church, the church where he had been pastor, because the cathedral had been bombed and was no longer usable, and outlined in detail just what had happened. Houses of religious orders had been stolen. And then he went from there into a direct attack on the secret state police, whom we know of as the Gestapo. And he says, you might have the quotations, but none of us is basically none of us is safe because the Gestapo has its own concentration camps. It's not answerable to any court for what it does, and it happens over and over again that people who are acquitted of a crime or who have done a crime and done their time are then hauled off by the Gestapo into their concentration camps, and there's no recourse for them. And we don't know how to communicate with them. We don't know where they are. And he details some of his own priests who were in concentration camps with no charges having been laid against them and no understanding of what they've supposedly done. And he says, none of us, no matter how faithful and good a German we are, is secure. None of us knows whether he might be arrested and put in a concentration camp at any time. This could happen to me. Of course, he knows very well it could happen to him now because he's of what he's saying right at this very moment. This could happen to me at any time, and so I'm going to speak out now on behalf of truth and on behalf of justice. And that he quotes the ancient maxim, justice is the foundation of states, and says that if we do not restore justice in our country, then no matter what victories our brave soldiers gain in the battlefield, Germany is decaying from within, and it will collapse upon itself. Yeah.
So this is the first of his great
sermons.
Of
the three great sermons of 1941.
What's the immediate effect of this sermon?
The people in the congregation were outraged, upset, and
this was public knowledge at the time. Like, he's breaking this news.
He's breaking the
news. Yeah,
I mean, some of them must have known because if you saw the Gestapo come to, if you lived nearby this monastery or whatever and saw these people being exiled, you'd know something. But he has kept a couple copies of it aside, and he told his secretary, he assumes that the Gestapo are going to come and want a copy of the sermon. And he says, give it to them. I've kept some copies behind. The Gestapo don't come for whatever reason. There were a number of priests present in the cathedral. They're really happy because they're getting leadership and guidance from their bishop, and it's really strong leadership. And one of them borrows a copy from the secretary and makes more copies of it. And then this starts to spread like wildfire. And like within a couple of days, there are copies of this sermon being spread across Germany. And to short circuit on that one, eventually they're spreading everywhere. They get into the hands of the British. The British start printing copies of it and dropping them from planes.
Wow.
All over Germany.
Can you imagine that?
So
writing something and then somebody's dropping your book all over an entire country.
Don't get hit. The museums in Munster, they have copies. They have some of these leaflets. There's a leaflet with a photograph of somebody else. That's supposed to be von Galen, but the text was there.
Yeah, that's what counts.
And this, by the way, this has a great influence on Hans and Sophie Scholl and the White Rose movement.
Ah, right. Yeah, can you tell us about the White Rose movement?
So there's a wonderful movie, Sophie Scholl, The Last Days, German movie with subtitles. That's very, very well done. So they were university students. Her brother had spent some time in the army, but they were in Munich, and starting to issue leaflets, students and some professors, and leaflets saying that this government is corrupt, that Hitler must go. Pretty strong stuff. And that we need basically to sabotage the war effort and various things like that. Von Galen never went that far, but these guys did. But what really got them started was receiving anonymously a copy of one of von Galen's sermons in the mail.
Wow.
Hans Scholl read this sermon and said, "We need to get a duplicating machine." And they did, and were secretly printing these leaflets. That's, I forget whether it's 42 or 43. And Hans and Sophie Scholl are putting these leaflets out in the atrium of the University of Munich. Well, everybody's in class, so as soon as they come out of class, they're going to see these things, and they push some of them over the ledge so they start fluttering through the air, and then start to leave. And a janitor catches them.
Oh man!
And they get handed over, and they get hauled before this notorious, horrible judge, Roland Freisler, who's a judge of the People's Court, I think it was called, but he berates the defendants in the witness box. He doesn't allow them to say what they're going to say. He's supposed to be a judge, but he's telling them what vermin and slime they are, and so on and so forth, and then condemning them to death. And Hans and Sophie Scholl were beheaded by the guillotine. That was the standard way one of the standard ways of killing people who have done something against the state. Yeah, you said earlier there are lots of martyrs in this story. These are among them, and some other friends of theirs were executed later. So this first sermon starts to have that effect. The next week, he steps up again, this time into the pulpit of the Church of Our Lady. And this time, he directly draws a distinction between the enemy, the foreign enemy, and the enemy within. And this goes back to World War I, right? Because the stab in the back legend that Germans thought that their armies out in the field were stabbed in the back by the politicians at home. Right. Yeah. But now he's saying the people doing the stabbing in the back are the Gestapo. They're the enemy within. They are undermining the foundations of the German state. And more expropriation of property has taken place. And then he goes briefly into all the different ways in which the call it the state, should we call it the government, should we call it the ideologists, should we call it the Nazi Party, probably the right term, in which the rights of God have been violated because natural law has been violated. It goes through the 10 Commandments, starting from, well, it doesn't go through 9 and 10, which are the 10s in thought, but 8 through 1. That every one of these has been publicly, sort of in an official way, violated or preached against by our government and its ideologists during the last years. And what he's concerned about is And what he was concerned about when he was dealing with trying to protect the Catholic schools, too, was that our young people are going to be drawn away from the faith. Mm. And he's often reminding parents of their sacred responsibility. And in this particular case, he brings in an image of the hammer and the anvil. He says, people are beating upon us in order to try to break us away and form us into a different kind of faith from the faith of our fathers, from the Catholic faith. But, he said, go to the blacksmith shop. Ask the smith. The thing that's formed is formed by the anvil just as much as it is formed by the hammer. And the anvil lasts longer. So you need to be hard and strong and tough like the anvil. Some of the monuments of von Galen throughout in different parts of Germany have images of anvils and hammers on them.
Oh, really?
Because this became this was this man who had this reputation of not being able to be a very good preacher.
Yeah.
But this came to him somehow, and he worked this image in that be strong, be firm, resist. You will resist the hammer's blow, and the consoling image of it, despite the fact you're getting banged around, because he's also saying, if you're going to be persecuted, well, blessed are you. Right. Which he says about the religious in the same sermon.
Right. And this is, just to connect a few different dots of other things that are put elsewhere, that he sees this persecution coming years out. Now it's
and so does Pius in brennender Sorge, which he may have gotten.
Yeah, let me read both of those. So this is a sermon, I think, from 1936, and he says, This is so good. I'm going to read a good bit of it. Like Christ, like the apostles, like the holy martyrs, we are obedient to authority, loyal to our people, conscientious in our professions, in our work, in our families, in our communities, willing to sacrifice, even to the risk of our lives, like Saint Victor and all holy soldiers, like our brave soldiers who risked and gave their lives for our German fatherland, and the thousands in the world war. He's talking about the first one there. But if, like those saints, we are put to the test and made to choose between earthly success and the confession of our faith, between the service of idols and death, then we want, like those brave models, we seek to emulate, to stay firm in the faith with the help of God's grace. We want, like them, to die rather than to sin.
Death rather than sin.
That's just amazing.
Yeah.
It's just incredible. And in particular, it's so hard. We're thinking about this when considering Blessed Franz Jägerstätter, that there's a matter of denying the faith with our words. Sometimes that comes in life, but very, very rarely do we really get to the point where we're, making the choice whether or not to stomp on the crucifix. But he brings up here is the service of idols, as the problem. It's like, do we help to reinforce this mass idolatry, or do we begin to fight against it? That is the thing that is actually more prominent, the prominent problem in our lives, the thing that we all do face. Anyways, and then there's this, I love this phrase, maybe more than any of the others that he helped Pius XI with. The Pope writes, our wholehearted paternal sympathy goes out to those who must pay so dearly for their loyalty to Christ and the Church, but directly the highest interests are at stake, with the alternative of spiritual loss. Excuse me, I'm reading this wrong. But directly the highest interests are at stake, with the alternative of spiritual loss. There is but one alternative left, that of heroism.
Of heroism.
You got one choice to be a hero. That's it. It's just incredible. So this second sermon comes.
Can I go back because that sermon from about Saint Victor that you were talking about. Early 1936. Saint Victor was a Roman soldier who was killed because he couldn't anymore serve the idols. And so von Galen in 1936 in blessing a church that was, or blessing a chapel that was dedicated to where St. Victor's relics had recently been found, or thought to have been found, and maybe really found, that he connects St. Victor in this way to the situation of Germans in 1936. But he also intriguingly says St. Victor was obeying the emperor. Because the emperor said, either worship these idols or die. So he died. So he didn't fight back against his fellow legionaries.
So he obeyed him in that regard. That's hysterical, actually. What a turn on everything.
And then he told his people, the Acts of the Apostles. The apostles say, we have to obey God rather than men when they're told not to preach in the name of Jesus, right? Death rather than sin, this ancient saying. And he quotes, and he does it again in these 1941 sermons, I forget which one, a German nobleman from a previous century under the time of Frederick II, who was asked by the king, or told by the king, to do something unjust. And the king says, don't you know that I could have you beheaded if you don't do what I tell you to do? And he said, my head stands at the king's pleasure, but not my conscience. And that's what he told his people that they should.
I mean, it is one thing to kind of, he prepared them well for the persecutions ahead. But then in the midst of it saying, yes, you are currently being, you are here. They are here. You are the anvil. You're being beaten upon. Just recognize that you're not a hammer. You are the anvil. So what a message.
Stay strong.
Stay strong.
Stay firm, and the anvil lasts longer than the hammer.
Now, do I have this right, that in between sermons 2 and 3, so of his 3 great sermons, there was a bombing of his home? Or is that afterwards?
That's later.
That's after the 13th.
That's 1943.
Things. Oh, it's 2 years later. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have these sermons, and then the carpet bombing really starts to happen. That's right. So the strategy of going over a particular town with the ally strategy.
Yeah.
Do you want to introduce this?
That had already been happening, and his house had been hit. By the first bombings, even before the first sermon.
That's right, because that's why he had to preach.
The really bad one was in 1943.
So could you just describe for us what these carpet bombings were? Yeah. How, so they would...
Do you want to do that now? That was famous. What was the guy named Bomber Harris? Was the British guy who thought that our great success in the war would come from getting the Germans so demoralized because we keep bombing their cities, right? And I don't know enough about the military strategists, because I think some of them have said, if we'd continued bombing the dams and destroying the industrial capability, we might have finished the war a lot earlier. And it's turned out in other historical situations that bombing cities to destroy the morale of the enemy often has an opposite effect.
Right? Vengeance rages. Yeah.
So the British were doing this at night, send a whole bunch of bombers in formation till they get to this spot that is the place where they're told, here's where you drop the bombs, and let them all go. And so you're just flying across a city, or could be a railroad yard, or a munitions factory, or a huge plant, or something like that. It could be a city, and just drop thousands of bombs. A carpet.
Right. And so the reason why I want to bring this up after this second major sermon is because his home was hit. He hears the sirens going off, and he hears some of the bombs starting to be dropped, and he has enough presence of mind to move into this doorway between his bedroom and his study. And I mean, this is just one of the amazing images that you provide for us, is that his bedroom blows up on his right, maybe you could say, and on his left, his study blows up. And the only thing that's left is the wall itself, supported by a chimney that's there, giving it stability. And so by the time, his doctor came around, or Father Portman?
Father Portman, his secretary, and somebody else came along too. And he's, so this is, yes, we're jumping ahead because this is October 1943, and this is us Yanks doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's us. This is Americans.
And and one reason why he didn't get to the air raid shelter at that time was that this was in the daytime on a sunny day, and bombing raids had always been at night. So the air raid signs going in the daytime, that can't be right. Yeah. And in fact, we didn't continue that practice very much because a fair number of bombers were shot down doing it that way.
Yeah. So he's stuck. He doesn't believe it. He doesn't move. Yeah.
So he's stuck with his episcopal palace sort of collapsed around him, and this one staircase and chimney sort of where he's standing, and there's some stuff burning around him, and he's trying to look for water to see if he can put that out. And he's scratched. He's not badly hurt, thank God. But he's his secretary comes along, and of course there's dust flying everywhere. But he sees the bishop up there.
Yeah, so he's like 2-3 stories up, right? I mean, there's not. I mean, it's crazy, this image that's in my mind, where it's just there's ruins, and there's a bishop up there.
Yeah.
It was crazy. You know? So it's not just that he's seeing other people take.
And there's kind of a hill of rubble that he can climb down eventually, so he makes his way down.
Yeah. It's incredible. But anyways, I kind of cut us off in the story of these great sermons because he's getting hit with these anvil. I mean, with the pow. He is the anvil. He is getting hit by the hammers here. I mean,
well, yeah, but it's American hammers at this stage.
But I think this is one of the most important things about him, is that eventually, when the Nazis do lose and the Allies do take over, they're confused by him because he's starting to wag his finger at them as well. Mm-hmm. He is, from to again kind of move back out to analysis of who he is and what he's doing. He's fulfilling the great obligation of the spiritual powers. He's looking at the world and he is declaring truth. He is diagnosing a problem, and he is trying to bring, and he doesn't have a bias towards one's way or the other. He sees an injustice and he's calling it out for people to come to repentance. I mean, this is in the Pius XI, also in the same encyclical. He says that the primary gift that priests are to give to their people is the proclamation of truth and the identification of error. And when we're talking about a great political saint here, you might, people might wonder, well, what was he doing? What was he organizing? How was he strategizing? He was playing the proper role of the spiritual power by trying to transform the temporal power, to redeem it and to turn it into something identifiably Christian. And so,
or at least identifiably just.
Yeah,
right. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Start somewhere, right? But this is, an outstanding thing is that his, he was, even after these air raids, people want revenge. I mean, these are citizens, helpless people that are being killed, that are not that are. I mean, just like moms, babies are being killed. And he says, look, you have to understand that if this is going to be a just war, by any measure, it has to be fought by just means. You cannot have a war be just because there is some sort of political public enemy on the other side. This is again where he's coming up to a criticism of something that Schmidt would and did articulate that you can have these public enemies, that they are not the people the enemies that Christ calls us to love. I mean, the
Yeah.
Christian tradition is so opposed to, or just so crazy. I mean, it's just amazing that I mean, we couldn't have come up with this on our own. The church has to
St.
teach us.
Augustine helped, St. Thomas
Yeah.
helped, a lot of other people have helped in coming up
Yeah.
with this.
It-
And yes, it's one thing for a war to be a just war, it's another thing for it to be fought justly,
yes.
right? And deliberately targeting civilians is one of the things that you're not supposed to do. You know?
Yep.
If you target a military factory and know that some civilians nearby might be killed, that can be, what's the term, acceptable collateral damage or whatever, but
A secondary effect.
But secondary effect, if you use the old traditional double effect theory, but to decide, and this was an interesting point in this 1943 bombing by the Americans, because the chief navigator, writes about this bombing. And when they got the orders and said the target, for the purpose of lining up your planes and your bombs, is the front steps of Munster Cathedral, he went to his commanding officer and said, "Hey, I don't think I can do this." And the commanding officer said, "This is war. Those guys have been killing civilians all over the place. They deserve what they're getting. You're my navigator. You're going."
He just said, all right, sir. Yes,
Yeah,
sir.
yes, sir.
And so at that point, he compromises. He doesn't, choose death over sin, heroism. He doesn't hand over his head and, to retain his conscience.
Yeah, well, no, and probably nobody on our side was without some kind of fault of that.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Because that's the awful thing about war in the first place.
Right.
That it makes us inhumane.
Right. So these are, I mean, such important topics that we're kind of hitting along the line. So the last one, before we let everybody go, is that he was the one that really brought to the attention of so many the eugenics program of the Nazis. And that was his third great sermon.
Third great sermon of 1941. He knew it was already happening, that patients in institutes for the mentally ill were being killed. It had happened in other parts of Germany. It was beginning to happen in parts of Munster. And what would happen was that a patient or a group of patients would be transported to a different part of the country. Shortly afterwards, their family would receive a message that they had died and been cremated, and that they could go and pick up the ashes for the payment of a fee. And as he put it in his sermon, the suspicion was widespread that these people were not dying of natural causes, because the philosophy had been spread, the ideology had been spread for years, and goes to pre-Nazi times, that life unworthy of life is better to be dealt with by a mercy killing. And Hitler had spread that same idea, and now it was happening. It was happening in a place in Munster itself, with institutions in Munster. And he pointed out the evil of this with such great force, and with the brilliance too of a practical, specific case that really struck home, and with some imagery. So the imagery is these people who are people like us. They have some disability. They've got some injury, or they've gotten very weak with age or whatever, but they're still human beings who deserve to be cared for. But now they're being treated like a piece of machinery that doesn't work anymore, or like an old cow that doesn't give milk anymore, or a horse that's become lame. and you can kill the cow or the horse, or you can scrap the machinery, but we're treating human beings this way. And he told a story, true story from one of the institutes in Munster. A middle-aged man with mental illness, but not sort of totally totally insane that he couldn't have friendly relations with his family.
Yep.
Had a visit from his son who was home from the front. The parting was difficult because they loved one another, and because who knows whether the son's going to see his father again because he could get killed at the front. No, the son is not going to see his father again because German citizens back home have killed his father.
The enemy within.
And the uproar caused by that sermon was enough that for a time, at least, what's called the T4 program was put on hold.
It's amazing. You mentioned in your book that there was only 2 occasions where there was a real Nazi policy that was reversed by public outcry. One of them was this. Mm-hmm. The other was a reversal of the decision to take out crucifixes of schools, and both of them were the results of Bishop von Galen's cries from the pulpit.
Yeah. He wasn't alone, because it was his people, his priests, and he always stressed that too.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, and that's
and the people are very important factors. Yeah. There's a member of Canada's Parliament, Garnet Jennings, from one of the Western provinces of Canada, who has von Galen's picture on his office wall.
Oh, wow.
And his grandmother, who was half Jewish, survived the war, being hidden by farmers in the Munster diocese. She was a teenager. So this is passed on in his family, that his grandmother attributed her survival to Bishop von Galen.
Wow.
To the atmosphere that he
supported
and cultivated in his diocese.
Wow. That is incredible. So his I mean, this is kind of the amazing thing when we look at the dynamics that the church has taught us. Just to return to these principles, trying to tie a few things here together. When Bishop von Galen, when Pope Benedict XVI, returns to the Rogistan and says, you could make a government based upon the collective decisions of people. But amidst our sin, things are not simply self-evident today. There needs to be this external directive, the church, the magisterial church, telling all nations, all peoples how to convert and to hold ourselves to cultivate justice. And that is what Bishop von Galen did during his time. He was this emblematic symbol of what the right bishop, what the church should do to be able to enable all of us to live right. And there was a real result. He proclaimed the truth. Things really did change. Now, of course, not to the dramatic effect.
He didn't stop the Holocaust. He didn't stop the war. He didn't stop the evils. But
thank God we're not judged on how effective we are. If we were, we might be killed just like
Mother
the eugenics
program. Right? God didn't ask us to be successful. He asked us to be faithful.
Right. Exactly. Otherwise it would be in a parallel to the eugenics program. How effective is this person? How productive is this disciple? It's, this is a completely different question, but you do see, at least here in the shadows, the operations of how things in the church ought to work, between the real absolute authority, which is God's church, that we are supposed to be converting towards and entering into, that our power might be used in the correspondence of the directives that she gives us, that we might become part of the church, that we might be able to spread it. So he's ultimately recognized for his heroism, choosing, would have chosen death
rather
over
than
than sin. In the midst of having one choice, he did choose heroism, and Pius XII ultimately did elect him as a cardinal at the very end of his life.
Yes, of course, had no idea that it was the end of his life. But Pius XII became Pope in 1939 at the beginning of the war. Didn't have any consistory to create cardinals during that time. And at the end of 1945, the announcement came out that he was going to have a huge consistory. I think John Paul might have had one or two that were similar size, but 32 new cardinals when the College of Cardinals was limited to 70 members.
That's
significant.
Yeah.
And it included Spellman in New York, and it included Heenan in Westminster, and Pius showed his respect for the Germans and his respect for specific Germans by choosing 3 Germans as cardinals, and one of them was Clemens August von Galen. And we never mentioned the fact that part of what made him impressive was not only that sort of this noble bearing that he had, but that he was big.
Yes, yeah. So we're gonna have Josiah put up a picture of this guy.
6.5 feet tall. Yeah. Put a picture up next to somebody smaller, perhaps.
Yeah.
And he was recognized at the various events of the consistory when it was his turn to come before the Holy Father to get first the red beretta and on another day the red hat. And the crowd started applauding. And the Italians were whispering to each other, Count Galen, il Conte Galen, Vescovo di Munster. And there was what was described as a triumphal applause for him when he came back down from receiving the red hat. The Americans who were there with Cardinal Spellman said, von Galen was the star of the conclave. Of the consistory, and nobody's jealous about that. And in fact, it'd be too long to describe. I think we had a really crazy difficulty getting to Rome. Long journey to get to Rome, interrupted by rainstorms and planes that were too small and trains that didn't run and various things like that. And Cardinal Spellman arranged an American military plane for him and the other 2 German cardinals to fly back to Paris and from there to get cars back home.
Wow, yeah. Was it the cheapest journey to Rome that any cardinal had ever taken?
It's because they have almost no money. They have German money, which is not going to be at all useful.
Right.
German post-war money, whatever it was, which couldn't translate into lira in Italy. And they're going to have to go down there and buy their red vestments and various other things. But as they're making their polite visits to one another, Cardinal Spellman or other cardinals from elsewhere would come and visit the German cardinals and chat with them. And as they leave an envelope, a big thick wad of money on a table. These guys are able to cover all their expenses. So yeah, von Galen said to his secretary at the end, don't think anybody has ever become a cardinal as cheaply as we 3 Germans have done. Yeah.
And so he comes back to his people and he kind of gives his...
Comes back to Munster, actually on his 68th birthday. And the inner city of Munster was like 90% bombed out. The cathedral's a ruin. Most of the wreckage is still just piled up in various places, so that provides people a place to sit or stand, and is received by the city which gives him the title of an honorary citizen of Munster, and they make an address to him, and then is received by officially on behalf of the church and the cathedral clergy of Munster, and he makes an address in front of about 50,000 people out in the streets on a cold March day, and speaks of the honor that the Holy Father showed, not him, them.
Mm.
He says it was there were many people who had to suffer much more than I did. They couldn't speak, they could only suffer. But I could speak. I had the responsibility to speak. I have a responsibility, as it says in the bishop's ordination, right, to call black, black, and white, white. So I spoke, and God blessed it. But it was your unity with me that gave me strength. And that also probably saved me from what could have been my fate, but would also have been perhaps my greatest blessing. And his voice broke, the crown of martyrdom. Because it was your solidarity that saved me from that, because they knew that if they struck the Bishop of Munster, all the people of Munster would have, and all the people of Westphalia would have been felt as if they were struck. And of course, the Nazis had said earlier on, we don't want to make him a martyr. He's trying to make himself a martyr. We won't allow that.
Right.
We'll take care of him after the war. Revenge tastes better cold.
Right. That's the line that was Goebbels that used that. Yeah, that revenge tastes is coming. Say that one more time. I can't say it.
Revenge tastes better cold. There's
yeah.
different ways it's expressed, but something like that.
And it is interesting. I mean, the number of times you bring up in your book the considerations. Do we take him out now? Do we arrest him now? We can't do that. As the back cover, says that Bishop von Galen, this is Hitler himself saying this, Bishop von Galen knows full well that after the war I shall extract retribution to the last farthing. And yet he couldn't do anything about it. I mean, because he would have lost. I mean, I think this is another part of the political situation that is very important to realize as they're building their God, that those in leadership cannot do whatever they want. They're not in full control. They are ultimately at the mercy of the people. How far can they convince them to go? How far can they pervert their desires? How much can they apply pressure through propaganda or fear or both to be able to get their expressed desires? But ultimately, their power is not in and of themselves. Their power only comes through their ability to affect the wills of other people. And taking out someone that everybody universally admired, like the bishop, was one of the great. It was their Achilles heel, and one of their Achilles heels I spell in multiple heels.
It's strange. I think they had a better sense than their enemies did about the power of public opinion.
Right. Yeah.
Strangely.
Yeah.
And the other bishops, and perhaps even von Galen up to a certain stage, didn't realize his own power in molding public opinion.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah.
And that may still be a problem that we have today, and it may be a problem that we will have in different ways throughout history of, as you quoted earlier, the Pope about the responsibility of priests to speak the truth. Right? Not being aware of that responsibility, and maybe not trusting the power of the truth to get out.
Yeah. One of the things I think is also becomes clear in reading of his life is that you have these two great orators, Adolf Hitler and Clemens August von Galen, and they are vying for ultimately the hearts of the people. They're converting them to one way or another. There's really no in between here.
And that's precisely how von Galen sees it. They're trying to take the hearts of our children from the faith. They're trying to take the hearts of us from our faith. Right?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And really, I think that is so many of us today see the state, the administrative state, that the structures in place are almost just not artifacts, but substances, like things that just are that can't be changed, and so we have to work within them. And certainly there's this proper respect that we have for the political power, the Christian consideration for revolt as a last consideration, prudence in our operations. But really, what we have to be aware of is that there is this call for our hearts primarily, and that through our desires we're going to be creating new things. And you just get a really clear snapshot of
Mm.
that in this kind of face off
Yeah.
between Hitler
Okay.
and von Galen. I think,
Interesting.
because even today, I mean, you think about, maybe the fear that some in the church may have to speak out boldly, clearly, and plainly, of the truth, and say, well, actually, the other guy is already doing that for his position. Why not you do
Yeah.
that for
Yeah.
Christ?
Yeah.
Win our hearts. Don't let them win our hearts. And that is, again, just moving back to the proper role of the spiritual powers. We as a laity cannot do what we are supposed to be doing if we do not have the truth proclaimed and error identified.
Just the fact that you pointed out in that order, I think, is useful too, because Von
Mm.
Galen pointed that out to his priests early on
Mm.
when they are teaching falsities.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the first thing to do in your preaching is to make a clear presentation of what the truth is, and then and only then identify the error, but refute the error. Don't attack persons.
Mm.
That was a strategy that he
Right.
was giving
Yeah.
early on.
Yeah. So, as we're kind of coming to the close, so I suppose we need to tie up the end of his life. He dies just a few days after he gives this last sermon that we were mentioning, or message upon, not quite a sermon,
Yeah.
a message as upon his return.
Yes. So that was the 16th of March, which was his birthday. He started having stomach pains. He, after a couple of days, finally said, "Oh, I better see a doctor," or agreed to have the doctors look at him. And they said, "You need an emergency appendectomy, like yesterday, right now." So he had surgery on the 19th, St. Joseph's Day, which was the anniversary of his baptism. And also, St. Joseph is, as you all know, not only is he patron of workers, but he's patron of a happy death.
Yes.
And he went into this surgery expecting, preparing for, and telling his secretary, "We brought this book back from Rome that tells you how to do a cardinal's funeral.
Yeah.
You better get that out and get ready." And he died on the 22nd of March. So just after this strong, huge, powerful, great man has made his, we can say, triumphal return to his own city, he returns to God. Just 6 days later, and then the crowds have to come out again a week after that for his funeral.
And they do, in droves. Well, so now we've completed his life. We've kind of analyzed it along the way. I think we see here the role that he fulfilled within the social order and how he began to call for its transformation and reformation. But maybe to do a strange personal thing, what is one aspect of his life in a snapshot that kind of sticks with you most? You've spent so many years, decades studying his life. Yeah.
Well, I think I might throw two in. One is his courage.
Yeah.
But another is connected with what you've been saying, the clarity of his thought and his presentation of the truth. Because that, I think, is the fulfillment of what you were talking about in the responsibility of a priest, a bishop, a pope, is that he had a lifelong practice that he learned from his father and then learned from school, but more from his father and from his mother, who taught him his catechism, that you need to break things down to the first principles. Yeah. I think that fits with Pope Benedict's presentation too, because, okay, we have to give you the first principles, remind you of what they are, but St. Thomas teaches us also working them down to specific applications is difficult.
Yep.
And that's where professionals and politicians and philosophers and theologians and whatever field of thought you're working on need to work out those specific applications.
Yep.
And his courage and his clarity of thought, and at the right times, his wit. To identify an evil system and the evil that was being done in its name, that sticks with me. Would that we had 10% of his courage and his clarity.
Father Daniel, thank you so much. I'm really grateful that you came this way for this conversation, and thank you so much for this excellent book. I mean, it's been moving for me.
I'm touched. Thank you very much for having me and giving me an opportunity to visit beautiful Ohio.
Yeah, yeah, it just looked like his Munster land. So,
my home state, not close to my hometown because I grew up in southwestern Ohio, but still, it's nice to be here.
Great, we're happy to have you. All right, well, everybody, thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next time with another saint. Thank you.